The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the USS Constellation as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez checked her equipment one final time. The ship rolled gently with the Pacific swells, but her hands remained steady as she adjusted the scope on her rifle. Today would be different from all the other days of routine drills and exercises. Today, everything she had trained for would be put to the ultimate test. Sarah had grown up in a small fishing town in Maine, where her father taught her to shoot tin cans off fence posts when she was barely tall enough to hold a rifle properly. Her mother had worried about such a tomboyish daughter, but her father always said that Sarah had eyes like a hawk and hands that never shook. He was right. By the time she turned 16, Sarah could hit a bottle cap at 200 yards in a crosswind that would make most grown men miss a barn door. The Navy had been skeptical when she first applied for sniper training. Women weren't commonly accepted into such programs, and many of the old guard officers believed that combat roles should remain exclusively male. But Sarah's scores on the shooting range were impossible to ignore. She consistently outperformed her male counterparts, not just in accuracy, but in composure under pressure. Her instructors began to take notice when she could put 3 rounds through the same hole while lying in mud during a thunderstorm. Admiral Harrison was one of those old guard officers who believed tradition should be respected above all else. He had served for 37 years, rising through the ranks during times when women served mainly as nurses and communications officers. The idea of a female sniper challenged everything he thought he knew about naval operations. He had watched Sarah's training reports with growing irritation, convinced that her scores were somehow inflated or that the standards had been lowered to accommodate her. The Constellation was currently part of a joint training exercise with Allied forces in the South China Sea. The operation, code-named Iron Shield, was designed to test rapid response capabilities in a simulated crisis scenario. Multiple ships from different nations were participating, creating a complex web of coordination challenges that would push every crew member to their limits. Sarah's role in the exercise was supposed to be relatively minor. She would provide overwatch during boarding operations, scanning for potential threats while other teams secured vessels. It was important work, but not the kind that typically drew attention from high-ranking officers. Admiral Harrison was aboard the Constellation as an observer, evaluating the performance of various units under his command. The first 2 days of the exercise had gone smoothly. Sarah had performed her duties efficiently, identifying mock threats and providing accurate intelligence to the boarding teams. Her calm demeanor and precise communication had earned respect from the other crew members, even those who had initially been skeptical about serving alongside a female sniper. On the 3rd morning, however, the exercise scenario took an unexpected turn. Intelligence reports indicated that hostile forces had captured a civilian research vessel and were holding the crew hostage. The ship, designated as the Aurora Scientific, was a converted cargo vessel that had been conducting oceanographic research in disputed waters. According to the scenario, armed militants had boarded the vessel and were threatening to execute the hostages unless their demands were met. The Constellation and 2 Allied vessels were tasked with mounting a rescue operation. The challenge was complicated by the fact that the Aurora Scientific was anchored near a cluster of small islands, making approach difficult and providing the militants with numerous escape routes. Additionally, the hostages were being held on the ship's upper deck, making any direct assault extremely risky. Sarah studied the intelligence photos and tactical briefings with growing concern. The layout of the target vessel was complex, with multiple levels and numerous hiding spots where militants could position themselves. The hostages appeared to be grouped together near the ship's bridge, but their exact location kept changing as the militants moved them around. Any rescue attempt would require split-second timing and absolute precision. Captain Rodriguez, the Constellation's commanding officer, called a planning meeting that included all department heads and key personnel. Sarah attended as the ship's designated marksman. though she expected to play a supporting role in whatever plan they developed. Admiral Harrison was also present, his weathered face showing the strain of commanding such a complex operation. The plan that emerged from the meeting was ambitious and dangerous. A small team of Navy SEALs would approach the Aurora Scientific in fast boats under cover of darkness, while the Constellation provided support from a distance. Sarah's job would be to eliminate any threats that presented themselves during the assault, but the range would be extreme, nearly 800 yards in choppy seas. Admiral Harrison voiced his skepticism immediately. He questioned whether accurate fire could be maintained at such a distance, especially from a moving platform. The shooting conditions would be challenging even for the most experienced marksmen, with wind, wave action, and the movement of both ships creating variables that could throw off even the most carefully calculated shot. Sarah listened to the discussion without speaking, her mind already calculating angles and adjusting for the various factors that would affect her shots. She had trained for exactly this type of scenario, spending countless hours on shooting ranges that simulated shipboard conditions. Her instructors had pushed her to master shots that others considered impossible, and she had developed an almost intuitive understanding of how to compensate for movement and environmental factors. The meeting concluded with the plan approved, despite Admiral Harrison's continued reservations. As the officers filed out of the conference room, Sarah approached Captain Rodriguez to discuss the technical aspects of her assignment. She needed to know the exact positioning of the Constellation during the operation, the expected weather conditions, and any other factors that might influence her shooting. Captain Rodriguez was a practical officer who valued results over politics. He had seen Sarah's training scores and witnessed her performance during previous exercises. Unlike Admiral Harrison, he had no reservations about her abilities. He provided Sarah with all the information she requested and assured her that she would have whatever support she needed to complete her mission. As evening approached, Sarah made her final preparations. She cleaned her rifle meticulously, checking every component and ensuring that her scope was perfectly calibrated. The weapon was a specialized sniper system designed for maritime operations, with features that helped compensate for the unique challenges of shooting from a naval platform. She loaded her ammunition carefully, selecting rounds that would perform optimally in the expected conditions. The weather forecast called for moderate seas, with winds gusting up to 20 knots. The moon would be new, providing excellent cover for the SEAL team, but making target identification more difficult for Sarah. She would be relying heavily on her night vision equipment and the thermal imaging capabilities of her scope. Sarah also spent time studying the layout of the Aurora Scientific one more time, memorizing every detail that might be relevant during the operation. She identified potential shooting positions on the target vessel and calculated the angles she would need for various scenarios. The more she studied the situation, the more convinced she became that success would depend on making shots that pushed the absolute limits of her equipment and training. The SEAL team commander, Lieutenant Collins, briefed Sarah on their planned approach route and timeline. The assault would begin at midnight, with the team moving in from the north side of the Aurora Scientific. Sarah would need to provide overwatch from the moment they entered the target area until all hostages were secured. The expected duration of the operation was 30 minutes, but it could extend much longer if complications arose. As the Constellation moved into position for the operation, Sarah took her place at the designated shooting station on the ship's upper deck. The position had been specially prepared with stabilization equipment and wind guards to optimize shooting conditions. Even so, the challenges would be formidable. The distance to the target was at the extreme edge of effective range, and the movement of both vessels would require constant adjustment. Admiral Harrison arrived at the shooting station just as Sarah was making her final equipment checks. He watched her work with obvious skepticism, occasionally shaking his head or muttering comments about the difficulty of the task ahead. His presence created an additional layer of pressure, but Sarah had learned to focus completely on her mission regardless of distractions. The tension aboard the Constellation was palpable as midnight approached. Every crew member understood the stakes involved in the operation. The scenario might be simulated, but the skills and procedures being tested were very real. Success or failure in this exercise could determine how effectively they would respond to an actual crisis. Sarah settled into her shooting position and began her final preparations. She controlled her breathing and cleared her mind of everything except the task ahead. Through her scope, she could see the Aurora Scientific in the distance, its lights creating an eerie glow against the dark water. Soon, the lives of innocent hostages would depend on her ability to place bullets exactly where they needed to go, despite odds that seemed almost impossible to overcome. The radio crackled with the voice of the SEAL team leader. "Overwatch, this is Neptune Team. We are beginning our approach. Request status on observation post." Sarah keyed her radio with steady fingers. "Neptune Team, this is Overwatch. I have eyes on target, standing by to provide support." Admiral Harrison stood behind her, his arms crossed and his expression doubtful. In a few hours, he would either have to acknowledge that he had been wrong about her capabilities, or he would have confirmation that his skepticism had been justified all along. Sarah could feel his eyes on her, but she pushed the distraction aside and focused on the dark water ahead, where a confrontation that would test every skill she had ever learned was about to begin. The first hour of the operation passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah maintained her position behind the rifle scope, watching the Aurora Scientific through the green glow of her night vision equipment. The SEAL team was making good progress toward their target, but they were still 20 minutes away from beginning their assault. Every few minutes, Sarah adjusted her position slightly to compensate for the ship's movement, keeping her crosshairs steady on potential threat locations. Admiral Harrison remained at the observation station, occasionally checking his watch and consulting with other officers through his radio headset. Sarah could hear fragments of his conversations, most of which centered on contingency plans and backup options. It was clear that he expected the operation to encounter serious difficulties, and he wanted to be prepared for multiple scenarios. The weather was deteriorating slightly, with wave heights increasing and wind speeds gusting higher than forecast. These conditions made Sarah's job significantly more challenging, as she had to constantly compensate for the movement of her shooting platform. The Constellation was holding position as steadily as possible, but even the most stable naval vessel could not eliminate all motion in rough seas. Through her earpiece, Sarah listened to the radio chatter from the approaching SEAL team. They were reporting normal conditions as they moved through the water in their specialized assault boats. The militants aboard the Aurora Scientific appeared to be unaware of the approaching threat, maintaining their routine patrol patterns around the captured vessel. Sarah had identified 3 primary threat positions where militants might establish firing positions during an assault. The first was the ship's bridge, which provided an elevated view of the surrounding water and excellent cover for a defender. The second was a cargo crane near the middle of the ship, which could be used as a sniper's nest by someone with basic tactical knowledge. The third was the stern deck area, where the hostages were believed to be held. Each of these positions presented unique challenges for Sarah. The bridge was the farthest target, requiring her to shoot across the full 800-yard distance with maximum compensation for wind and movement. The cargo crane was at a moderate range, but positioned at an angle that would require her to shoot around the ship's superstructure. The stern deck was the closest target, but also the most dangerous, since any shots fired there would be in close proximity to the hostages. As the SEAL team reached the final approach phase, Sarah began to observe increased activity aboard the Aurora Scientific. The militants were clearly becoming more alert, though they had not yet detected the approaching threat. She could see figures moving around the deck areas, and thermal imaging revealed additional personnel inside the ship's superstructure. Lieutenant Collins's voice came through the radio with increased urgency. "Overwatch, Neptune team is in position for final approach. We're seeing movement on the target vessel. Request immediate assessment of threat positions. Sarah keyed her microphone and responded with calm precision. Neptune team, I have visual confirmation of at least 6 individuals on deck. 3 are positioned near the bridge area, 2 at the cargo crane, and 1 at the stern near the hostage location. All appear to be armed and maintaining defensive positions. Admiral Harrison leaned closer to listen to the radio traffic, his expression growing more concerned with each update. The number of militants was higher than anticipated, and their positioning suggested they were more organized than the intelligence reports had indicated. This was exactly the type of complication he had been worried about. The SEAL team leader acknowledged Sarah's report and began coordinating the final assault plan with his team members. The approach would require precise timing, with multiple entry points being breached simultaneously to prevent the militants from regrouping. Sarah's role would be critical in eliminating threats that could interfere with the assault or endanger the hostages. As the assault boats reached the hull of the Aurora Scientific, Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly. This was the moment when everything could go wrong very quickly. She controlled her breathing and settled deeper into her shooting position, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Through her scope, she could see the SEAL team members preparing to board the target vessel. The first shots of the engagement came from the militants, not the assault team. Someone aboard the Aurora Scientific had spotted the approaching boats and opened fire with automatic weapons. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as bullets sprayed across the water, forcing the SEAL team to take cover and return fire. Sarah immediately identified the source of the hostile fire, a militant positioned behind the cargo crane with what appeared to be an assault rifle. The range was approximately 600 yards, with moderate wind and wave action affecting both ships. She calculated the necessary adjustments in a fraction of a second and squeezed the trigger. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder, and through her scope, she watched the militant suddenly stop firing and disappear behind the crane structure. She could not confirm whether her shot had been lethal, but the immediate threat to the SEAL team had been eliminated. Admiral Harrison, watching through binoculars, made a surprised grunt but said nothing. The assault team took advantage of the covering fire to board the Aurora Scientific successfully. Within minutes, they were engaged in close-quarters combat throughout the ship's lower decks. Sarah could hear the sounds of gunfire and explosions through her earpiece as the team moved to secure the vessel and locate the hostages. A new threat emerged as 2 militants appeared on the ship's bridge, attempting to set up a heavy machine gun that could devastate the SEAL team's position. The range was the full 800 yards, and both ships were now moving more violently due to the wake created by the assault boats. Sarah knew this would be the most difficult shot she had ever attempted under operational conditions. She adjusted her scope settings and calculated the complex ballistics required for the extreme range shot. Wind speed was gusting irregularly, and the movement of both vessels created a constantly changing firing solution. Sarah had trained for exactly this scenario, but training ranges could not perfectly replicate the stress and complications of actual combat. Through her earpiece, she heard Lieutenant Collins's urgent voice. "Overwatch, we need immediate suppression of the bridge position. They're setting up a crew-served weapon that will pin down our entire team." Admiral Harrison was now watching intently through his binoculars, clearly understanding the critical nature of the situation. The success of the entire operation might depend on whether Sarah could make a nearly impossible shot under extreme conditions. He had spent the past several days questioning her abilities, but now her performance would be tested in the most demanding circumstances possible. Sarah steadied her breathing and waited for the optimal moment when both ships were momentarily stable in the wave pattern. The crosshairs in her scope danced slightly as she tracked the militant who was attempting to position the machine gun. She had perhaps 3 seconds before the weapon would be ready to fire on the SEAL team below. The mathematics of the shot were incredibly complex. She had to account for the bullet's flight time over 800 yards, the wind speed and direction, the movement of both ships, and the precise positioning of her target. Too high, and the bullet would pass harmlessly over the militant's head. Too low, and it would strike the ship's superstructure. A few inches to either side would result in a complete miss at this extreme range. Sarah made her final adjustments and began to squeeze the trigger with steady pressure. In the background, she could hear Admiral Harrison saying something to another officer, but the words were lost as her entire world narrowed to the view through her rifle scope. The militant on the bridge was almost finished setting up his weapon. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as Sarah completed her trigger pull. She felt the familiar recoil of her rifle and immediately began to track the bullet's impact through her scope. At 800 yards, there would be nearly a full second of flight time before she could see the result of her shot. Through her earpiece, she could hear the ongoing firefight aboard the Aurora Scientific. The SEAL team was making progress in securing the lower decks, but they were still vulnerable to fire from the bridge position. If the militants succeeded in getting their machine gun operational, it could force the assault team to withdraw and abandon the hostages. Sarah watched through her scope as her bullet traced its path across the dark water between the two ships. The trajectory looked correct, but at this extreme range, even small variables could cause a miss. Wind conditions were constantly changing, and both vessels continued to move unpredictably in the rough seas. Admiral Harrison had his binoculars trained on the Aurora Scientific's bridge, waiting to see the result of Sarah's shot. His expression was tense, and Sarah could sense his doubt about whether she could successfully make such a difficult shot under these conditions. She had proven her accuracy on shooting ranges and during training exercises, but this was her first test under actual operational stress. The bullet impact, when it came, was clearly visible through both Sarah's scope and Admiral Harrison's binoculars. The militant who had been setting up the machine gun suddenly collapsed, and the weapon itself was knocked from its position. The threat to the SEAL team had been eliminated with a single, precisely placed shot at maximum effective range. Lieutenant Collins' voice immediately came through the radio. "Outstanding shot, Overwatch. Bridge threat is neutralized. We're proceeding to secure the hostage location." Admiral Harrison lowered his binoculars slowly, his expression showing a mixture of surprise and reluctant admiration. He had just witnessed marksmanship that exceeded anything he had thought possible under such challenging conditions. The shot would have been impressive on a calm day at a shooting range, but making it from a moving ship in rough seas bordered on the miraculous. Sarah continued to monitor the situation through her scope, scanning for additional threats as the SEAL team moved toward the stern of the Aurora Scientific, where the hostages were being held. She could see movement in several areas of the ship, but most of the militants appeared to be either eliminated or retreating to defensive positions inside the superstructure. The final phase of the operation would be the most dangerous, as the assault team attempted to rescue the hostages without allowing the remaining militants to harm them. Sarah maintained her overwatch position, ready to provide additional fire support if required. The success of the mission now depended on the SEAL team's ability to reach the hostages before the militants could carry out their threats. Admiral Harrison remained at the observation station, but his attitude toward Sarah had clearly changed. The shot he had just witnessed was undeniable proof of her exceptional abilities. She had succeeded where many experienced military marksmen would have failed, demonstrating skills that challenged his preconceptions about women in combat roles. The radio chatter from the Aurora Scientific indicated that the SEAL team was encountering fierce resistance as they approached the hostage location. Several militants had barricaded themselves in the stern section of the ship and were using the hostages as human shields. The situation required extreme precision from the assault team to avoid casualties among the innocent civilians. Sarah could see the standoff developing through her scope, with SEAL team members positioned around the stern deck area while militants held defensive positions near the hostages. The range was now at the shorter end of her capabilities, but the proximity of innocent civilians made any shot extremely risky. One slight miscalculation could result in tragedy. The tension aboard the Constellation was palpable as everyone involved in the operation waited to see how the hostage situation would be resolved. Sarah maintained her position behind the rifle, ready to take action if an opportunity presented itself. Admiral Harrison continued to observe through his binoculars, now watching Sarah's performance with genuine interest rather than skepticism. The standoff continued for several minutes, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The militants were well positioned and clearly willing to use the hostages as protection, while the SEAL team could not advance without risking civilian casualties. It was exactly the type of situation that could turn a successful operation into a disaster. The standoff at the stern of the Aurora Scientific stretched into its 10th tense minute. Through her scope, Sarah could see the SEAL team members positioned strategically around the deck area, but the militants had created an almost impenetrable defensive position using shipping containers and deck equipment as cover. 3 hostages were clearly visible, bound and positioned where any rescue attempt would put them in immediate danger. Lieutenant Collins's voice crackled through the radio with growing frustration. "Overwatch, we need options here. The Tangos have excellent cover and clear lines of fire on the hostages. We can't advance without significant risk to the civilians." Sarah studied the scene carefully through her scope, analyzing angles and distances. The militants had positioned themselves cleverly, using the ship's structure to limit the SEAL team's approach routes while maintaining control over the hostages. However, their defensive position had one potential weakness, a narrow gap between 2 shipping containers that would provide a brief shooting opportunity if someone moved through it. Admiral Harrison was monitoring the radio traffic intently, clearly understanding that the operation was reaching a critical decision point. The SEAL team could not maintain their position indefinitely, and any prolonged standoff increased the risk that the militants would carry out their threats against the hostages. Success or failure now depended on finding a way to break the deadlock. Sarah keyed her microphone with a steady voice. "Neptune team, I have a possible solution. There's a gap between the containers at the stern that provides a narrow shooting lane. If you can force movement in that area, I may be able to eliminate the primary threat." Lieutenant Collins responded immediately. "Understood, Overwatch. Can you guarantee the shot at that range with hostiles in close proximity to civilians?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah knew that her answer would affect not only the current operation, but potentially her entire future in the Navy. Admiral Harrison was listening to every word, and her response would either confirm his doubts about her capabilities or demonstrate the confidence that separated truly exceptional marksmen from ordinary shooters. Sarah's reply was calm and measured. "Affirmative, Neptune team. I can make the shot." Admiral Harrison looked at her sharply, his expression showing disbelief at what he considered an impossible guarantee. The range was over 400 yards to a target area barely 18 inches wide, with innocent civilians positioned just feet away from the intended target. Wind conditions continued to be challenging, and both ships were still moving in the rough seas. Even the most experienced sniper would hesitate to guarantee success under such conditions. The SEAL team leader acknowledged Sarah's assessment and began coordinating a plan to force the militants into movement. The strategy involved creating a diversion at one end of the defensive position while simultaneously applying pressure from another direction. If executed properly, it would force at least one of the militants to move through the gap that Sarah had identified. As the assault team prepared to implement their plan, Sarah made her final adjustments to her rifle and scope settings. The shot would require absolute precision, with no margin for error. She controlled her breathing and settled into her most stable shooting position, mentally calculating the ballistics for what would likely be the most important shot of her career. The diversion began with a flashbang grenade detonated at the port side of the stern area. The explosion created confusion among the militants, causing them to shift positions and respond to what they perceived as the primary threat. Simultaneously, SEAL team members applied pressure from the starboard side, forcing the defensive positions to split their attention between multiple directions. Through her scope, Sarah saw exactly what she had anticipated. One of the militants, apparently the leader based on his position and equipment, moved quickly through the gap between containers to coordinate his team's response to the assault. He was visible for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for Sarah to confirm her target identification and execute her shot. The mathematics of the shot were complex, but not impossible. Sarah had to account for a moderate crosswind, the movement of both ships, and the precise timing required to hit a moving target in a confined space. More importantly, she had to ensure that her bullet would not endanger any of the hostages if it somehow deviated from its intended path. Sarah began her trigger squeeze as the militant appeared in her scope's crosshairs. The world around her seemed to slow down as she focused entirely on the shot. She could hear Admiral Harrison's breathing behind her and the distant sounds of the firefight, but these distractions faded into the background as her training took over. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder, and Sarah immediately began tracking the bullet's impact through her scope. At this range, the flight time would be approximately half a second, long enough for doubt to creep in, but not long enough to make any corrections. The shot was committed, and now physics and ballistics would determine the outcome. Through her earpiece, she could hear the sounds of intensified combat as the SEAL team took advantage of the confusion to advance their position. However, the critical question remained unanswered. Had her shot achieved its intended effect, or had she missed at the crucial moment when everything depended on her marksmanship? The answer came through Lieutenant Collins' excited voice. "Outstanding shot, Overwatch! Primary threat is down! We're moving to secure the hostages now!" Admiral Harrison lowered his binoculars and stared at Sarah with an expression that mixed amazement with reluctant respect. He had just witnessed something that challenged every assumption he had held about women in combat roles and the capabilities of the new generation of military personnel. The shot had been executed flawlessly under conditions that would have challenged the most experienced marksman in the Navy. Sarah continued to provide overwatch as the SEAL team completed their assault on the remaining militants. Within minutes, all hostile forces had been eliminated or captured, and the hostages were secure. The operation that had begun with significant skepticism from Admiral Harrison had concluded with a demonstration of marksmanship that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. As the immediate tactical situation stabilized, Sarah finally allowed herself to relax slightly. She maintained her position behind the rifle until the all-clear signal was given, but the tension in her shoulders began to ease as reports confirmed that all hostages were safe and accounted for. The mission that had tested every skill she had ever learned had ended successfully. Admiral Harrison approached Sarah's position as she began to secure her equipment. His usual stern demeanor was replaced by something approaching humility as he acknowledged what he had witnessed. The shots she had made during the operation were beyond anything he had thought possible, particularly under the challenging conditions they had faced. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez," Admiral Harrison said, in a voice that carried none of his earlier skepticism, "that was some of the finest marksmanship I have ever witnessed in 37 years of naval service. I believe I owe you an apology for my earlier doubts about your capabilities." Sarah looked up from her equipment with surprise. She had expected professional acknowledgement of her performance, but an apology from Admiral Harrison was something she had never anticipated. Throughout her career, she had learned to prove herself through actions rather than words, and she had long ago stopped expecting recognition from officers who questioned women's roles in combat. "Thank you, Admiral," Sarah replied simply. "I was just doing my job and applying the training I've received." Admiral Harrison shook his head slowly. "No, Lieutenant Commander. What you did out there went far beyond standard training. Those shots required skills that can't be taught, They require natural ability combined with exceptional mental discipline. You demonstrated both tonight in ways that few people ever could. The conversation was interrupted by radio calls from the Aurora Scientific, where the SEAL team was completing their post-operation procedures. All hostages had been confirmed safe and were receiving medical attention for minor injuries. The militants had been secured, and evidence was being collected for analysis. The operation had achieved complete success without any casualties among the friendly forces or hostages. Captain Rodriguez joined them at the observation station, having monitored the entire operation from the ship's bridge. His expression showed the satisfaction of a commanding officer whose people had performed flawlessly under pressure. The success of the operation would reflect well on the entire crew of the Constellation, but particularly on Sarah's exceptional performance. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant Commander," Captain Rodriguez said with genuine admiration. "Your shots tonight made the difference between success and potential disaster. The SEAL team leader has specifically requested that his commendation include recognition of your support." Sarah accepted the praise graciously, but her mind was already moving beyond the immediate success to consider the broader implications of what had occurred. The operation had provided undeniable proof of her capabilities, but it had also demonstrated something more important, that skill and dedication mattered more than gender or traditional expectations. Admiral Harrison spent several more minutes discussing the operation with Captain Rodriguez and other officers, but his attention frequently returned to Sarah. The transformation in his attitude was remarkable, shifting from skepticism to genuine respect in the span of a few hours. He had witnessed performance that challenged his fundamental assumptions about military capabilities and combat roles. As the Constellation began its return journey to base, Sarah found herself reflecting on the events of the night. The shots she had made were certainly challenging, but they were within the range of skills she had been developing for years. What surprised her more was the reaction of Admiral Harrison and other officers who had witnessed her performance. The next morning, Admiral Harrison requested a private meeting with Sarah in the ship's conference room. She arrived expecting a routine debrief about the operation, but instead found the Admiral reviewing a stack of personnel files and training reports. His expression was thoughtful as he looked up from the documents. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez," he began, "I've been reviewing your service record and training scores. I have to admit that I allowed personal biases to cloud my judgment about your capabilities. What I witnessed last night was extraordinary marksmanship that few people could achieve under any circumstances, let alone the conditions we faced." Sarah listened respectfully, uncertain where the conversation was heading. Admiral Harrison had a reputation as a fair but demanding officer, and his acknowledgement of bias was both surprising and significant. "I'm recommending you for advanced training at the Navy's Special Operations Command," Admiral Harrison continued. "Your skills are too valuable to be underutilized, and you've proven that you can perform under the most demanding conditions. I believe you could make significant contributions to special operations units that require precision marksmanship." The offer was both flattering and potentially career-changing. Special Operations Command assignments were highly competitive and typically reserved for the most exceptional personnel. Sarah had always hoped to advance to such roles, but she had expected the path to be much longer and more difficult. "I'm honored by your confidence, Admiral," Sarah replied. "I would be very interested in pursuing advanced training opportunities." Admiral Harrison nodded approvingly. "Good. I'll be submitting the paperwork today. You should expect orders within the next few weeks." He paused, then continued in a more personal tone. "I want you to know that last night changed my perspective on a lot of things. I've always believed in tradition and established procedures, but you've shown me that excellence can come from unexpected places." Several months later, Sarah found herself at the Navy's elite sniper school, training alongside the most skilled marksmen from all branches of the military. The program was demanding, pushing students to master shooting techniques that bordered on the impossible. However, The skills she had developed and demonstrated during the Aurora scientific operation served her well. Her instructors quickly recognized her exceptional abilities, particularly her composure under pressure and her ability to make accurate shots under challenging conditions. The story of her performance during the rescue operation had preceded her to the school, creating expectations that she consistently met and exceeded. Admiral Harrison, meanwhile, had become an advocate for expanding opportunities for women in combat roles throughout the Navy. He frequently cited Sarah's performance as evidence that capability should be the only criterion for assignment to demanding positions. His change in perspective influenced policies that opened new career paths for female service members. The operation aboard the Aurora Scientific became a case study in naval special operations, with particular attention paid to the long-range sniper support that had proved crucial to the mission's success. Sarah's shots were analyzed and discussed in training courses, providing examples of how exceptional marksmanship could influence the outcome of complex operations. Years later, when Sarah had advanced to command her own special operations unit, she often reflected on that night in the South China Sea. The operation had tested her skills under the most demanding conditions possible, but it had also demonstrated something more important: that determination, training, and natural ability could overcome any obstacle, including the prejudices of those who doubted her capabilities. Admiral Harrison, now retired, occasionally visited Sarah's unit during training exercises. Their relationship had evolved from skepticism and doubt to mutual respect and genuine friendship. He took pride in having recognized her potential and recommended her for advanced training, conveniently forgetting his initial reluctance to accept her capabilities. The story of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez and her impossible shots during the Aurora scientific rescue became legend within the Navy's special operations community. New recruits learned about her performance as an example of what was possible with proper training and unwavering determination. The shots that Admiral Harrison had once believed impossible were now taught as examples of achievable excellence. Sarah never forgot the moment when Admiral Harrison had expressed his doubts about her ability to make that shot. By the time he had finished speaking, she had already proven him wrong with marksmanship that exceeded even her own expectations. The operation had changed both of their careers and demonstrated that excellence could emerge from the most unexpected circumstances, challenging assumptions, and opening new possibilities for future generations of naval personnel.